I never thought I'd be fighting an army of suburban bureaucrats on my own farm, but here we are. Imagine this. You buy a slice of raw, unadulterated freedom in the countryside, where every sunrise over your fields reminds you that you're the boss. That was me, until one scorching morning turned my peaceful life into a full-blown war zone. I was making my usual rounds, boots kicking up dust on the gravel, when something caught my eye. A dusty, battered van parked in the middle of nowhere. Before I could even register the sight, a sharply dressed man emerged, his uniform adorned with the title HOA Inspector. For a split second, I thought I was dreaming. Since when did my farm, a sanctuary of honest work and endless skies, become a part of some suburban community's petty rules? The inspector strode up with a clipboard clutched tightly in his hand and a look of smug entitlement plastered on his face. "Good morning, sir," he said, his tone dripping with authority that had no business being on a rural property. "We've received complaints that your property is not in compliance with community standards." Complaints? I almost choked on my coffee. Here I was, miles away from any tidy subdivision, and this guy was acting as if I'd planted a row of ugly hedges by mistake. As he began measuring my weathered fence and scribbling notes, I felt a surge of indignation. Every inch of my land was earned with sweat and hard work, and now some pencil-pushing enforcer was trying to dictate how I should live. But the real punch came when he flashed me a smile that screamed, "I own this part of town now." In that moment, my blood boiled. This wasn't a mix-up, it was a deliberate power play. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, and a fierce determination took hold of me. I wasn't going to let these overreaching clowns bully me off my own land. Right then, as I locked eyes with the inspector, a gaze that said, "You've messed with the wrong man," I knew that my quiet, independent life was about to collide head-on with an absurd, overzealous system. And believe me, this was just the spark that ignited a battle I never saw coming. After that electrifying introduction, the very next few days confirmed that the HOA's unwanted intrusion wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the beginning of a full-scale operation aimed at bending my independent life to their suburban agenda. It started the day after that fateful morning. I was out in the fields, the sun barely cresting over the horizon, when I first saw him again, the so-called HOA Inspector. This time, he wasn't alone. Accompanying him were two equally officious-looking assistants clad in matching uniforms. They rolled up in a second, nondescript van, the engine rumbling like an unwanted storm approaching. I could almost feel the weight of their entitlement bearing down on my land. I was working near my old barn, fixing a loose board on the weathered fence, when I noticed them methodically walking toward me. My heart rate spiked. I wiped my hands on my worn jeans and squared my shoulders. "Back again, are we?" I called out, trying to keep my tone even, though every fiber of my being screamed annoyance. The inspector stepped forward, clipboard in hand, his expression as smug as if he were the mayor of a pristine suburb. "Good morning, sir," he said with an artificial smile. "We're here to perform a routine inspection of your property to ensure it meets the community standards that have been established by the HOA. His voice carried that unyielding authority that made you want to slap your ears in disbelief. I folded my arms and gestured around at the sprawling fields, the uneven, dusty paths, and the humble structures that defined my life. Routine inspection. This is a farm, not a manicured suburban lot. I assure you, my property doesn't fall under any HOA jurisdiction. My words were firm, edged with disbelief at the audacity on display, but the inspector wasn't swayed. He tapped his clipboard as if that would magically make his demands valid. "We've received multiple complaints from residents in the area regarding your property's upkeep," he declared, voice flat and unyielding. I couldn't help but note how ridiculous it sounded. Complaints? My neighbors live miles away in neighborhoods that proudly display their cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns. My land, with its wild fields and time-worn structures, was as far removed from community standards as you can imagine. One of his assistants stepped forward, his eyes scanning my property with a measuring gaze. "Sir, we need to verify that your fence and other structures adhere to the prescribed limits. There are guidelines you must follow," he said, almost reading from a script. I could practically see the gears in his mind turning, trying to find any loophole or vague regulation to justify their intrusion. I laughed, a short, bitter laugh that carried both disbelief and defiance. "Guidelines? You mean the ones that don't exist for my land?" I shot back. The inspector's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment I could see that his smile was less genuine and more like a rehearsed line meant to intimidate. As they circled around my property, I paid close attention to every detail. I noted how the inspector measured my fence with a laser device, a tool more at home in a high-tech construction site than on a rustic farm. I could almost feel the cold precision of that device against the warmth of the morning sun. His assistants took copious notes, their pens scratching furiously on notepads, as if documenting some kind of criminal activity rather than a simple property inspection. I tried to maintain a calm demeanor, but internally, I was seething. Every step they took, every measurement they recorded, felt like an encroachment not only on my property but on my very way of life. I reminded myself that my farm wasn't just a plot of land. It was a testament to my independence, my struggle against a world that wanted to control even the simplest aspects of living. When the inspector finally turned back to me, his tone had shifted subtly. "Sir, it appears that some of your structures might not be in compliance with what we consider acceptable for community aesthetics," he said, as if implying that my humble barn was an eyesore. I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to snap back immediately. "Community aesthetics," I repeated slowly. "I've lived on this land for years. My barn, my fields, even my overgrown hedges are part of what makes this place authentic. I don't need your approval or your so-called standards." My voice grew louder, drawing the attention of the assistants. They exchanged glances, their expressions betraying a hint of uncertainty. Before I could press further, one of the assistants leaned in and whispered something to the inspector. The man's face tightened imperceptibly, and he scribbled another note on his clipboard. Then, in a measured tone meant to sound final, he said, "We'll return tomorrow with additional measures. In the meantime, please keep your property available for further inspection." His words were delivered with the cold precision of someone who believed they were enforcing the law. That was the last straw. As they marched back to their van and drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. My land, my sanctuary, was now under siege by a well-oiled machine determined to impose its rules on everything it touched. And I vowed then and there that I would not let them bully me into submission. I watched their van disappear down the dusty road, my mind racing with plans for resistance and defense. I already had my camera ready, my notebook in hand, and a burning desire to document every outrageous step they took. This was not just a routine inspection. It was a declaration of war against my right to live freely. As I turned back toward the barn, the cool breeze carrying the scent of fresh earth and upcoming rain, I couldn't help but feel a surge of adrenaline mixed with determination. The battle had just begun, and I was ready for every twist it would bring. The next morning, I woke up with an uneasy feeling, as if the universe was warning me that the HOA's antics were about to escalate. I arrived on my property early to inspect the damage from yesterday's routine inspection, and what I found left me both furious and determined. Right along the edge of my land, someone had painted a thick, gaudy line with bright blue paint. It wasn't just any line. It was meant to mark my property as if it belonged to a suburban lot under the HOA's control. My first reaction was disbelief. How dare they physically mark my land as non-compliant? I grabbed my camera immediately, determined to document every detail. The paint glistened in the morning sun, stark against the natural hues of the soil and grass, an affront to everything I'd worked for. I zoomed in on every drip and smudge, capturing the evidence that the HOA had crossed a line, literally. As I was setting up my evidence station by the barn, I heard the distant hum of engines. My heart sank. I looked up to see the familiar dusty van rolling back onto my property. This time, the van pulled up alongside my tractor rather than near the barn. Out stepped the HOA inspector again, but this time he was flanked by a new face, a sharply dressed man with a smug expression who introduced himself as the compliance officer. "Good morning, sir," the compliance officer said, his tone smooth and insincere. "We're here to follow up on yesterday's inspection. We've received additional complaints regarding your property's appearance and alleged safety hazards." I squared my shoulders, feeling the weight of the previous day's events. "Safety hazards?" I scoffed. "My property is safe and well within my rights. You're the ones creating hazards by imposing your rules on me." The inspector exchanged a glance with the compliance officer before replying, "Sir, it's not just about safety. It's about maintaining the community standards. Our records indicate that properties in our district should have a certain look and feel. Your rustic style doesn't meet that criterion. I could feel my anger boiling over. My farm isn't part of your so-called community, I retorted sharply. I don't need to conform to some cookie-cutter aesthetic you've invented. They didn't respond with words immediately. Instead, the compliance officer motioned for one of his assistants to take measurements along the perimeter of the painted line. The assistant pulled out a high-tech laser measure, his device's red beam slicing through the early light as he recorded the dimensions of my property's boundary. I paced back and forth, frustration mingling with a growing sense of urgency. I decided it was time to escalate my own response. "Listen," I said, my voice steady but edged with defiance. "I have all my property records right here. You're operating on assumptions and fabricated complaints. Why don't you check the official land deeds instead of wasting time marking my land with your paint?" The inspector's face twitched, as if caught off guard. "Sir, you misunderstand. We're simply enforcing the guidelines set by the HOA board." His tone was icy, and I could tell that he was reciting a script. I glanced around. The van's engine idled ominously, and I noticed that a tow truck had quietly parked at the side of the road, a detail that made my blood run cold. Had they planned something more drastic? My mind raced with possibilities. Were they preparing to tow away one of my vehicles as punishment for non-compliance? I had heard stories of similar tactics in suburban disputes, but never imagined they would come to my doorstep. Before I could voice my concerns, the compliance officer handed me a thick envelope. "This is a formal notice of violation," he said curtly. "You are required to remove any elements of your property that do not meet the community standards. Failure to comply may result in further legal and administrative action." I flipped open the envelope. Inside were a series of intimidating letters filled with legal jargon and deadlines that seemed designed to create panic. I felt my pulse quicken. It was clear that they were not going to stop at painted lines and measurements. Their next step was a full-on intimidation campaign. I immediately called my attorney, Dan, who assured me that my property records were on my side. "Your land is completely outside the HOA's jurisdiction," he told me over the phone. "These documents are nothing more than empty threats designed to scare you." But even as Dan spoke, I knew that the real battle was only just beginning. As I stood there in the early light, staring at the envelope and the freshly painted boundary, I felt a mix of defiance and apprehension. Every detail, the impersonal laser measurements, the cold words from the compliance officer, the ominous presence of the tow truck, spoke of a systematic effort to force my property into their domain. I took a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air fill my lungs, and made a silent vow. I wasn't going to be bullied off my land without a fight. I would document every intrusion, gather every piece of evidence, and stand up for my rights, no matter what tactics they employed. As the van slowly drove away, leaving behind the stark, defiant mark of blue paint on my soil, I knew I was now locked in a war against an overzealous system, and trust me, I was ready to fight every step of the way. Just when I thought the HOA's harassment couldn't get any more absurd, a twist hit me like a sledgehammer. It was a cool, overcast afternoon, and I was busy sorting through the pile of intimidating letters and official-looking envelopes when I noticed something peculiar. Tucked between the formal violation notice and a generic warning letter was a small, unassuming envelope addressed in neat handwriting. My curiosity piqued. I tore it open. Inside, I found a single sheet of paper with typed text that sent a chill down my spine. The letter stated that a compliance initiative was being launched immediately, not just on my property, but across several rural areas that were unfairly caught in the HOA's expanding jurisdiction. As I read on, it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Apparently, the inspector and his team were not merely enforcing community standards, they were actively seeking to annex properties by misrepresenting them as non-compliant with arbitrary rules. The document mentioned that several farms like mine were being targeted, and that these measures were part of a broader, covert effort by a rogue faction within the HOA to boost their membership numbers and revenue. My hands trembled as I read. Could it be that they had deliberately designed this whole operation? I realized that the painted blue line, the laser measurements, and even the tow truck hovering ominously in the background were all part of a calculated plan. They were setting the stage to later declare my property in violation and then force me into a legal battle that would eventually strip me of my freedom. This wasn't just bureaucratic overreach. It was an orchestrated power grab. I immediately grabbed my phone and recorded myself reading the letter, capturing every word as evidence. With shaky hands, I called Dan, my attorney, and explained what I'd found. "This document," I said, "suggests that your HOA isn't just meddling with my property. They're deliberately trying to drag rural landowners into their fold through intimidation and legal trickery. It's a planned initiative, a wolf in sheep's clothing." Dan's voice was steady but grim on the other end. "This is serious," he confirmed. "If they're doing this on a larger scale, we need to document everything. I suggest you secure all of your evidence and start reaching out to other landowners who might be facing the same harassment." Determined to uncover the full scope of this conspiracy, I began combing through my archives, emails, security footage, and the many letters the HOA had sent. Late that night, as a thunderstorm rolled in, I pored over hours of security footage captured by my newly installed cameras. In one clip, I caught a glimpse of the inspector speaking quietly with a man in a dark car near the edge of my property. Their conversation was too hushed to make out, but the body language was unmistakable. They were discussing something secretively, glancing around nervously as if afraid of being overheard. My mind raced. Had the inspector been receiving orders from someone higher up in the HOA? And if so, who? I started contacting a couple of neighbors who had received similar, yet slightly different, violation notices. One of them, a farmer from a neighboring property, admitted that he'd been harassed repeatedly by the same team. He confessed, "I've had inspectors pop up at odd hours, marking my land and issuing bogus fines. I thought I was just being paranoid until I saw the blue paint on my boundary." His words confirmed my worst suspicions. In the midst of all this, an email popped into my inbox from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "Don't let them take your freedom." Inside was a scanned document that appeared to be an internal memo from within the HOA. It outlined a plan to standardize rural properties by forcibly bringing them under HOA regulations, thereby increasing control over areas that were once independent. The memo mentioned incentives for inspectors to hit their targets and penalties for landowners who resisted. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was concrete proof of a systematic effort to bully and annex properties like mine. I printed out the memo and saved digital copies of every piece of evidence I could gather. I knew that if I could expose this plan, I'd have the support of not only my attorney, but also the broader community of landowners who were silently suffering under these unjust practices. With the storm raging outside, I sat alone in my study, surrounded by piles of evidence and scribbled notes. The gravity of the situation hit me hard. It wasn't just about a single painted line or a misdirected inspection. It was about an entire system trying to control independent lives, and I was right in the middle of it. I made a decision then and there. I wasn't going to let this planned takeover go unchallenged. I would use every tool at my disposal, from legal action to public exposure, to stand up for my rights and the rights of every landowner being bullied by this rogue faction. As the wind howled outside and the rain battered the windows, I felt a fierce determination rise within me. The HOA's plot was laid bare, and I was ready to fight back with all I had. This revelation was the turning point. My battle was no longer just personal. It was about protecting the freedom of every independent property owner. After discovering the insidious memo and watching the storm of evidence pile up, I realized I had to change tactics. I couldn't simply stand by while the HOA's rogue faction tried to annex my freedom away. The weight of the revelation hit me hard, and for a long moment, I just sat there staring at the scattered papers and video files on my desk. My heart pounded with a mix of anger and determination as I began formulating my counterattack. The very next morning, I started by securing my property even further. I upgraded my security system, adding extra cameras, reinforcing locks, and installing motion sensors at every vulnerable point around the perimeter. I wasn't taking any chances. Every new piece of evidence I'd collected was now backed by an even tighter fortress around my land. I even rechecked the old footage, now scanning for any additional clues of misbehavior by the inspector or his cronies. I then reached out to my attorney, Dan, to discuss the best legal strategies to counter this systemic harassment. Over a long, tense phone call, we reviewed all the evidence: the fraudulent violation notices, the mysterious internal memo, and even the anonymous email with its damning details. Dan's tone was measured but grave as he explained, "This isn't just about your property anymore. We're dealing with a coordinated effort to force rural landowners into compliance. We need to prepare for a legal battle that could set a precedent." His words made it clear that I was up against not just overzealous bureaucrats, but a whole organized network determined to control independent land. Armed with Dan's advice, I began reaching out to other landowners in the area who had been harassed similarly. I attended local town meetings and started a small group on social media dedicated to fighting HOA overreach in rural communities. The support was overwhelming. Stories poured in from farmers and residents who, until now, had felt isolated and powerless. It was a turning point. I wasn't alone. I was part of a growing movement of people who refused to be bullied. During this period, I meticulously organized all of my evidence into clearly labeled folders, both physical and digital. Every letter, every piece of video footage, every email. Nothing was left unrecorded. I even set up a dedicated website to share my story, complete with a timeline of events and downloadable copies of key documents. I wanted the public to see how far the HOA was willing to go and to galvanize support from anyone who believed in property rights and individual freedom. I also started holding informal meetings at my farm. Over cups of strong coffee and slices of homemade pie, fellow landowners and local residents gathered on my porch. They shared their own experiences and ideas for resisting these oppressive tactics. One elderly farmer, whose land had been nearly marked last year, told me, "Son, I've been through more red tape than I care to remember. But together, we can remind these pencil pushers that our land is ours by right." His words resonated deeply with me, and I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Every day, as I roamed the fields, I began documenting not only the invasive actions of the HOA's team, but also the natural beauty and freedom of my property. I captured the golden light of dawn over the fields, the rustling of tall grass in the breeze, and the peaceful chirping of birds in the distance. These shots weren't just for my own morale. They were powerful reminders of what was at stake. My land wasn't just a commodity. It was a living testament to a way of life that the HOA wanted to control. At the same time, I kept a detailed log of every encounter with the HOA inspectors. I recorded the dates, times, and descriptions of their actions. I even saved voicemails and text messages that carried the cold, impersonal language of bureaucratic intimidation. Every bit of detail strengthened my case. As days turned into weeks, I felt both the weight of the battle and a mounting sense of triumph. Each time I reviewed the evidence, I grew more certain that the HOA's tactics were not only illegal, but morally indefensible. I began to draft public statements and prepare for the inevitable confrontation in court or at a city council meeting. The more I prepared, the more resolute I became. I wasn't just protecting my property. I was standing up for every independent landowner who had ever been trampled by red tape. I also reached out to local media, sharing my story and inviting reporters to witness firsthand the audacity of the HOA's actions. The local paper picked up my story, and soon, letters of support began to flood in from across the region. I felt vindicated, not just by the evidence, but by the communal outcry against an institution that had overstepped its bounds. In the quiet moments, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, I reflected on how drastically my life had changed. What began as a simple morning encounter with a self-important inspector had evolved into a full-blown crusade for justice and freedom. Every new measure I took, every conversation I had, was a step toward reclaiming my land and my peace of mind. With my security tightened, my legal strategy in place, and a community rallying behind me, I felt ready to face whatever the HOA threw my way next. I wasn't just adapting, I was turning their own tactics against them. And as I closed my eyes that night, I knew that this battle, though fierce and unyielding, was one I was destined to win. Just when I thought I had a handle on the HOA's intimidation campaign, new complications emerged that threw yet another wrench into the works. One overcast afternoon, while I was reviewing my growing file of evidence in the farmhouse, I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel drive. I looked up, my stomach tightening, and saw a group of people pull up in a modest, unmarked van. This wasn't the familiar HOA inspection team. These were new faces, looking almost like community compliance volunteers, a term I found laughably ironic. Out stepped a man with a clipboard and a headset, his manner far more casual than the inspector I'd encountered. "Hello there, sir," he said, with a smile that felt rehearsed. "We're here on behalf of the Community Standards Review Committee." His tone implied that he was just a concerned citizen, but I knew better. His arrival so soon after the last incident was clearly another move in the HOA's game. I greeted him coolly. Community Standards Review Committee, huh? That sounds like a fancy way of saying we're here to enforce our nonsense. I couldn't help the sarcastic lilt in my voice. He paused, clearly taken aback by my tone, and then continued as if nothing was amiss. We've received additional reports about possible safety hazards and non-compliant structures on your property, he said, gesturing vaguely toward my barn and the various outbuildings. Our role is to help ensure that every property in our jurisdiction adheres to the community's established guidelines. I arched an eyebrow. My property wasn't even in their jurisdiction, yet here they were, ready to lecture me on aesthetics and safety. Before I could respond, a local farmer, one of my longtime neighbors, arrived on his pickup truck. He seemed agitated. "Hey, I got a call from someone in the committee," he said, glancing nervously at the newcomers. "They mentioned something about inspecting your property, and I thought I'd come see what's happening." His tone was a mix of concern and frustration, and it struck me that he, too, had been caught off guard by these relentless visits. He admitted, "I've been hearing similar stories from other farmers nearby. It looks like this isn't just about your place anymore." That revelation sent a jolt through me. Suddenly, the battle wasn't mine alone. It was a coordinated attack on all of us independent landowners. I quickly invited the farmer to join me inside so we could compare notes. Over cups of strong bitter coffee, he detailed how he'd also received a cryptic violation notice, filled with legal jargon and deadlines that made little sense. He even mentioned that a similar group had been seen near his property the previous night. This confirmed my suspicion. The HOA's rogue faction was expanding their campaign, targeting multiple properties to create an atmosphere of fear. As the conversation unfolded, I received a text message from another neighbor, a woman whose property bordered a small woodland. Her message was terse. "They're here again. I just saw them marking my fence with the same bright blue paint." I quickly added her complaint to my log, realizing that the HOA's tactics were becoming more widespread and coordinated. In the midst of these developments, I began receiving anonymous phone calls in the dead of night. The caller's voice was muffled, but one thing was clear. They were warning me that things were about to escalate further. "Watch your back," the voice said cryptically, "because they're not done yet." At first, I dismissed it as someone trying to stir trouble, but then I found that even my security cameras caught faint figures lurking in the shadows around my property, figures that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on them. The mounting pressure forced me to consider additional strategies. I reached out to a local journalist who had previously covered cases of government overreach in rural communities. I showed him some of the evidence, photos of the blue paint, video clips of the unauthorized inspections, and even a snippet of the anonymous call recorded on my phone. The journalist's eyes widened with interest, and he promised to look into the story further. This media angle, I realized, might be the key to turning the tide, as public exposure could force the HOA to back down. Not only were the inspectors and compliance volunteers intensifying their efforts, but I soon learned that someone within the HOA was leaking information to interested parties. Rumors began circulating in the local community about a faction within the HOA that was desperate to boost their membership numbers by forcibly annexing rural properties. One old-timer at the local diner confided, "I've seen them hand out flyers and even offer incentives to sign up for the HOA, promising benefits that are nothing but smoke and mirrors." This subplot of internal corruption added a new layer to the conflict. If I could expose these internal machinations, I'd have a much stronger case. In a moment of both anger and determination, I decided to organize a small community meeting at my farmhouse. I posted a notice on social media and even went door to door, inviting all affected landowners to share their experiences. The turnout was modest at first, but soon word spread, and a handful of us gathered on my porch, voices low but resolute. We exchanged stories of arbitrary inspections, baseless violation notices, and even the unsettling anonymous calls. The collective frustration was palpable, and I could see that we were beginning to form a unified front. As the meeting drew to a close and plans were made to document our shared grievances further, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about defending my own land anymore. It was about standing up for an entire community that had long been ignored and bullied by an overzealous institution. I promised myself that we would fight back together, using every piece of evidence, every recorded encounter, and every public statement to expose the HOA's true agenda. Before I knew it, night had fallen, and as I returned to my study, I couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA was preparing for an even bigger move. The anonymous calls, the coordinated inspections, and the creeping unrest among our neighbors, all of it was leading to something monumental, and I knew, deep in my bones, that the next chapter in this battle was about to begin. In the days that followed the community meeting, emotions ran high, and the situation on my farm grew even more tangled. It wasn't just about defying an overreaching HOA anymore. It had become a personal war that tugged at my very core. Every interaction with the inspectors and compliance volunteers felt like a small betrayal, and I could feel my resolve hardening even as I wrestled with deep-seated doubts. One cool evening, as dusk settled over my land, I received a visit from a longtime neighbor named Charlie, a rugged fellow with hands worn by years of hard work. He had a tired yet determined look in his eyes, and as he approached my farmhouse, I could sense the weight of unspoken frustrations. We settled on the porch, the cool breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut hay and distant thunderstorms. "Look, I've been hearing all about what's happening," Charlie said softly, glancing around as if fearful of being overheard. "I've had inspectors knocking on my door too, and I'm starting to wonder if we're all being set up." His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the burden of feeling powerless against a system that seemed to pick on us all. I nodded, feeling the sting of every baseless accusation. "I know exactly how you feel," I replied, my tone both reassuring and laced with bitter sarcasm. "I never imagined I'd have to fight for the right to tend my land. It used to be simple. Wake up, work, eat, sleep. Now every day feels like I'm in a courtroom drama starring me as the underdog." As the conversation deepened, Charlie shared his own harrowing encounters, random visits at ungodly hours, inspectors who seemed more interested in intimidating than inspecting, and the unnerving anonymous calls that kept him awake at night. His words painted a vivid picture of a community slowly being pushed to the edge, each neighbor grappling with their own mix of anger, fear, and hopelessness. In that moment, I felt both solidarity and a heavy loneliness. Here we were, a band of independent souls, united by our defiance yet isolated by the weight of constant harassment. I confessed, sometimes I lie awake at night wondering if I should just give in, if I should let them dictate what I do on my own land. But then I look out over these fields and remember why I bought this place in the first place. I can't let them win. Charlie's eyes softened with understanding. "You're right," he said firmly. "We have to stand up, even if it feels like the whole world is against us." That night, as I returned to my study, I replayed the day's encounters in my head. The phone calls, the furtive glances from inspectors, and the cold, bureaucratic tone of the violation notices all blended into a chaotic symphony of betrayal. I sat at my desk, the glow of my computer screen illuminating piles of meticulously organized evidence, photographs of blue paint splattered along my fence, detailed logs of every interaction, and recordings of voices filled with hollow authority. Each piece of evidence was a small victory, but also a reminder of the relentless assault on my freedom. In the quiet of my study, the emotional toll of this struggle began to weigh on me. I wondered if my fight was worth the constant stress, the sleepless nights, and the fear of what might come next. I thought about my family, the legacy of hard work that had brought us to this land, and the simple pleasures of watching the sunrise over fields untainted by red tape. The contrast between that serene vision and my current reality was jarring, and for a moment, I allowed a wave of despair to wash over me. Yet, as I sat there with my thoughts swirling, I also felt an unexpected surge of determination. I recalled the faces of neighbors like Charlie, the anonymous voices in my inbox urging me not to back down, and the unwavering conviction in my own heart. I began drafting a long post on my newly created website, a detailed account of the HOA's misdeeds, interlaced with personal anecdotes and raw, honest emotion. I poured out every frustration, every pang of betrayal, and every spark of defiance into the post. It was cathartic, a way to channel the emotional turmoil into something that could help rally others to our cause. Later that week, I received a flood of supportive comments from fellow landowners and even strangers who had faced similar battles. Their words of encouragement reminded me that I wasn't alone, that our collective struggle was real and shared. It was in those moments of vulnerable exchange that I realized the true power of our resistance. We were not just defending property, we were reclaiming our right to live authentically, without the suffocating grip of an overzealous system. Yet, even as hope began to spark, there remained an undercurrent of tension. I was haunted by the memory of a recent anonymous call. "Watch your back because they're coming for you next." That simple threat echoed in my mind as I reviewed the day's events. Mingling with the promise of solidarity and shared struggle, it was a stark reminder that the HOA's tactics were as unpredictable as they were invasive, and that the emotional toll of this battle was far from over. In the solitude of that stormy night, as rain pounded on my roof and the wind howled like the voices of a million frustrated souls, I vowed to keep fighting. I would let every moment of vulnerability, every tear shed in frustration, fuel my resolve. I was ready to face the next wave of their intimidation, knowing that behind every act of harassment lay a community of resilient, determined individuals unwilling to be silenced. Just when I thought the HOA's harassment couldn't intensify any further, the situation took an unexpected turn that left me both shocked and even more determined to fight back. One early morning, as I was out checking the perimeter of my farm with a freshly updated security system, I noticed a commotion near the north field, a section of land I had painstakingly cleared for crop rotation. A group of unfamiliar vehicles had quietly rolled onto my property. Their engines rumbled softly, almost as if they were the sound of an approaching storm. I quickly grabbed my camera and hurried outside. There, standing in the center of my field, was a man dressed in a suit that screamed corporate authority rather than rural compliance. His badge read Community Liaison Officer, and he was flanked by two individuals who wore expressions of rehearsed professionalism. They weren't the usual low-key inspectors I'd encountered before. This group exuded a calculated air of intimidation. "Good morning," the liaison officer said, his voice unnervingly calm. "We're here to verify that all properties in our jurisdiction are in line with the updated Community Improvement Plan." I couldn't help but snort at his phrasing. The Community Improvement Plan was a nebulous concept that never applied to rural properties like mine, and his presence only underscored the absurdity of it all. I replied coolly, "My land isn't even in your jurisdiction. I suggest you review your maps before deciding which property to target next." His face, however, remained impassive. One of his assistants, holding a digital measuring device, began scanning the fields with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Before I could protest further, a new development emerged. A tow truck, its headlights glaring in the early dawn, rolled quietly up the access road. Its arrival wasn't random. It was as if it was summoned by a silent command. The tow truck driver, who I recognized from previous encounters, nodded curtly at me as he parked beside my tractor. It became immediately clear that the HOA's tactics were evolving from mere inspections to potential physical actions. As the driver started unloading what appeared to be heavy equipment, buckets and chains, and what looked like demolition tools, I felt a surge of panic mixed with fury. My mind raced. Were they preparing to dismantle part of my fence? Or worse, were they planning to tow away one of my vehicles? I grabbed my phone and started recording the scene. Every moment, every detail was evidence of their relentless escalation. Then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "They're not done yet, watch your back." The message was brief but loaded with a threat. I felt a chill run down my spine as I showed the message to one of my security cameras on the spot. The camera's red recording light blinked, capturing the unsettling moment as I continued to film the approaching crew. Not long after, another surprise hit. While reviewing the footage on my phone later that morning, I noticed a shadowy figure lurking near the barn, a figure that hadn't been there during the initial inspection. The person appeared to be watching the entire episode unfold from a distance, hidden behind a cluster of trees. Was this another member of the HOA's team, or an entirely different player in this scheme? The uncertainty made my pulse quicken. That same afternoon, during my routine check of the evidence folder I had been compiling, I received a phone call from a neighbor. His voice was urgent as he explained that a small group of local farmers had been approached by an anonymous messenger. They were handed flyers containing vague but menacing warnings about unauthorized properties and community purity. The flyers bore the same blue paint color that now marked my property's boundary. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a coordinated campaign to intimidate independent landowners across the region. The situation escalated further when I discovered that one of the compliance volunteers had mistakenly left behind a tablet in a secluded spot near my chicken coop. Curiosity got the better of me, and when I powered it up, I found a series of internal communications. The messages revealed that the rogue faction within the HOA was not only targeting properties, but was also planning a large-scale community audit designed to force landowners into signing up for the HOA under the threat of punitive fines. The messages were laced with bureaucratic jargon and cold directives that sent shivers down my spine. I spent hours poring over the data on that tablet, my heart pounding as I realized the full extent of the conspiracy. The document trails, internal memos, and even chat logs showed a network of officials scrambling to enforce regulations on properties that weren't even under their control. It was an elaborate power play, and I was right in the middle of it. By dusk, I had a mountain of evidence, yet the day's surprises kept coming. While reviewing all this new material on my computer, I received another anonymous call. This time, the caller warned, "They're coming for you tonight." The voice was distorted, and although I couldn't decipher every word, the threat was clear. That night, I sat in my study, the glow of my computer screen illuminating the piles of documents and video clips. The constant escalation, the unannounced visits, the threatening text, the mysterious tablet, and the anonymous warnings had transformed this battle from a bureaucratic nuisance into a full-scale war for my freedom. Every new surprise, every unexpected turn, only deepened my resolve to expose and fight against this overreach. I knew then that the stakes had been raised to a whole new level. Not only was my property being targeted, but the entire community of independent landowners was under siege. And as I prepared for whatever might come next, one thing was abundantly clear. The next chapter of this fight was going to be more dangerous and unpredictable than ever before. As the days rolled on, the puzzle of the HOA's relentless campaign began to form a clearer picture. I started connecting the dots between all the disparate incidents, the unauthorized inspections, the painted boundaries, the anonymous threats, and the mysterious tablet I had found. It wasn't just random harassment, it was a coordinated strategy, a full-on power grab aimed at subjugating independent landowners. Late one night, while reviewing yet more footage from my security cameras, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. In one clip, the inspector was seen having a hushed conversation with a high-ranking official from the HOA. The official's badge wasn't as pristine as the others. It had scratches and looked oddly out of place. In the background, a white van with the logo of a local property management firm pulled up discreetly. This wasn't just about enforcing vague community standards, it was a merger of forces. Somehow the HOA was working hand in hand with private interests that stood to benefit from annexing these rural lands. My curiosity turned into a full-blown investigation. I dug into public records and local business listings, and what I uncovered was staggering. Several of the companies involved in property management had recently seen a sudden spike in new contracts that oddly aligned with the timeline of the HOA's intensified activities on my property and those of neighboring farms. There were whispers on local forums about incentives being offered to landowners who voluntarily joined the HOA. In reality, the HOA was using these incentives as bait, hoping to lure out independent property owners into signing over control. One evening, while sifting through emails, I discovered an attachment from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "Proof of the plot." Hesitant but determined, I opened it and found a series of internal emails exchanged between several HOA officials. The emails were damning. They detailed a plan to roll out what they called a compliance audit across all rural properties. An audit designed to find any excuse to levy fines, impose new regulations, or even force a property owner to sign up for membership under threat of legal action. One email in particular caught my attention. It mentioned maximizing revenue through strategic annexations and using our inspectors as the front line for community transformation. It was clear the HOA wasn't just overstepping its boundaries, it was planning to fundamentally alter the fabric of rural property ownership in our region. Armed with this new evidence, I contacted a trusted neighbor who had experienced similar harassment. Over a late-night phone call, he revealed that he'd seen printed flyers that bore striking similarities to those I'd received, flyers that promised community benefits if he joined the HOA. He admitted that, at first, he had considered the offer, not realizing it was a trap. His story validated my growing suspicions and underscored that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic assault. I then reached out to my attorney, Dan, and shared every piece of evidence I had collected so far, from the internal emails to the public records. Dan was both appalled and impressed. "This is a goldmine," he said. "If we can show that the HOA's actions were part of a coordinated scheme to annex rural properties for profit, we'll not only win your case, but set a precedent for others." His words lit a spark of hope, and we began planning our next legal steps with renewed vigor. At the same time, I started keeping a detailed diary of every encounter, every message, and every unusual incident. I created a timeline that mapped out the escalation, from the first painted line to the increasingly aggressive inspections and the mounting evidence of internal collusion. Every detail added another layer to the story, painting a picture of an institution willing to bend the law for profit and control. The revelations weren't just legal or bureaucratic, they were deeply personal too. Each discovery reinforced the injustice I felt. Not only was my freedom under siege, but so was the freedom of every independent landowner in our community. I realized that by exposing the HOA's true motives, I could galvanize a whole network of people who had silently suffered under similar pressures. One particularly unsettling revelation came when I found a security camera clip from a neighbor's property. It showed the community liaison officer, who had appeared so polished and professional, arguing with a local official over the precise boundaries of several farms. The conversation was heated, and the official's tone was urgent, almost as if he feared what might happen if the plan was fully executed. This snippet of footage confirmed that the stakes were higher than I'd imagined. By connecting all these elements, the internal emails and the public records, the eyewitness accounts and the security footage, I finally saw the full scope of the conspiracy. The HOA was not acting alone. It was a well-orchestrated operation designed to force independent property owners into a corner. And now that I had compiled this mountain of evidence, I knew I had the upper hand. With every new connection made, my resolve strengthened. I was no longer fighting a petty bureaucratic battle. I was up against a corrupt system, determined to reshape our rural landscape for its own benefit, and I was ready to expose it all, come what may. The mounting pressure reached a boiling point. One cold, grey morning, when I received a call that would upend everything. My attorney, Dan, informed me that several local farmers had banded together to file a formal complaint with the city council. They were fed up, not just with my case, but with the entire HOA's aggressive overreach into our lives. The call set the stage for a confrontation that would force the hand of those in power. I arrived at the small community center where the emergency meeting was scheduled, my evidence folder clutched tightly under my arm. The room was packed with anxious faces, farmers, local business owners, and even a few sympathetic city officials. The air was thick with tension, and every murmur of conversation confirmed what I already knew. The time had come to confront this injustice head-on. At the front of the room, the council chairman called the meeting to order. "We have received multiple complaints regarding unauthorized actions by the HOA on rural properties," he began. His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable firmness. I could see the same resolve reflected in the eyes of those gathered. It was as if the community had finally had enough of the intrusive tactics that had disrupted their lives for too long. Dan introduced our case, outlining the evidence we'd collected over the past few weeks. The internal emails, the security footage, the anonymous messages, and even the dubious violation notices. I watched as the council members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from skepticism to concern as we laid out the facts. The evidence was overwhelming, a meticulously compiled trail of documents and recordings that painted a damning picture of a rogue faction within the HOA, willing to intimidate and bully independent landowners into submission. As the presentation continued, a heated discussion erupted among some council members about jurisdiction and enforcement. One official argued that the HOA had every right to enforce its rules, while another vehemently countered that the evidence clearly showed a deliberate and illegal power grab. The debate grew louder, and it was clear that the council was deeply divided. In that moment, I realized that the outcome of this meeting would not only affect my future, but could also set a precedent for every independent landowner in our area. Suddenly, the door swung open, and in strode the infamous HOA Inspector, flanked by his usual entourage. His arrival sent a ripple of murmurs through the room. With a forced smile, he stepped up to the lectern, as if he were about to reclaim control. "I'm here to represent the HOA's interests," he declared, his voice dripping with a false confidence. "We are merely enforcing community standards for the greater good." I couldn't hold back any longer. "Community standards," I snapped, my voice rising above the clamor. "What you call standards are nothing more than arbitrary rules, designed to intimidate and annex properties that don't belong to your gated community." My words resonated in the hushed room, and for a moment, even the HOA inspector's confident facade faltered. One council member, an older man with a stern expression, leaned forward. "Sir, can you provide concrete evidence that your property is not under HOA jurisdiction?" he asked. I nodded, opening my evidence folder to display the official land deed and survey documents that clearly outlined my property's boundaries. The room fell silent as everyone examined the documents, and even the inspector hesitated, unable to refute the clear official records. At that moment, Dan stepped forward. "We also have internal communications from the HOA that reveal a deliberate plan to force independent properties into compliance," he said, producing copies of the internal emails we had obtained. The internal memos were handed out to several council members, and a murmur of disbelief swept through the crowd. It was undeniable. The HOA had orchestrated a scheme to bully us into submission. The tension reached its peak when a representative from one of the local property management companies, a company implicated in the scheme, was called to the stand. His testimony confirmed that incentives had indeed been offered to landowners in exchange for joining the HOA, and that the same tactics we had experienced on my property were being used elsewhere. The evidence was irrefutable. By then, it was clear that the council's mood had shifted dramatically. The majority of members now sided with us. A decisive vote was taken, and the council unanimously ruled that the HOA's actions on my property, and by extension, on those of other independent landowners, were illegal and constituted a gross abuse of power. The ruling demanded that all further actions by the HOA in rural areas cease immediately, and that an investigation into their practices be launched. The room erupted in applause, and I felt a surge of vindication so powerful it nearly brought tears to my eyes. The confrontation had reached its critical point, and justice was on the horizon. Even the HOA inspector, now visibly shaken, attempted to protest, but his words were drowned out by the collective voice of the community and the firm stance of the council. As the meeting adjourned, I gathered with fellow landowners. Our shared relief mingled with cautious optimism. We knew this victory was just the beginning, a significant blow to the HOA's oppressive tactics. I left the community center with my head held high, determined to continue the fight if necessary, but bolstered by the knowledge that together we could stand up to even the most powerful of bureaucracies. The energy in the aftermath of the council meeting still hung in the air like a charged storm, but as I returned to my property, I knew that while the council's ruling was a monumental step forward, the battle was far from over. I had to face the HOA representatives head-on to ensure that their tactics would no longer haunt me or my fellow landowners. That evening, I decided to stage my own direct confrontation. I had been contacted by several local farmers who, emboldened by the council's decision, were ready to demand accountability. We organized a small gathering right on my property, a symbolic stand against the oppressive forces. As dusk settled, a few of us gathered near the barn, where the soft glow of lanterns and the steady hum of conversation set the stage for what was about to happen. Not long after, I heard the familiar rumble of the HOA's van approaching. Out stepped the HOA inspector, this time flanked by two other representatives who seemed to have been summoned for damage control. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in their eyes. They weren't here for a routine inspection anymore. They knew we were ready for a confrontation. The inspector cleared his throat and stepped forward, his voice measured as he addressed the assembled crowd. "Good evening, sir. We're here to remind you that your property must comply with the community standards as previously outlined. We request that you cease all actions that may be deemed non-compliant." I stepped forward, my posture confident and unyielding, and addressed him in a calm but firm tone. "With all due respect, I have already provided clear evidence that my property lies outside any HOA jurisdiction. The community standards you claim to enforce do not apply here. My land and the lives of my neighbors will not be dictated by your arbitrary rules." A hush fell over the group. One of the other representatives tried to interject. "Sir, please understand that these measures are for the greater good, ensuring that all properties maintain a certain aesthetic that benefits everyone." I couldn't help but scoff at that. The greater good? You mean the good of a bureaucratic machine that doesn't know the first thing about real life on the land? I built my farm with sweat and determination, not with your fancy manufactured standards. The inspector's face reddened slightly, and he glanced briefly at his colleagues before responding. "We are simply enforcing the guidelines that have been established by the HOA board. You must either comply or face further legal action." His tone was laced with a threat, but I could sense the uncertainty behind his words. I then held up a thick folder filled with documents, emails, and security footage. "Let's review the facts, shall we?" I said, flipping through the pages. "Here is my property deed. Here are the official survey records, and here are the internal emails that expose your organization's deliberate plan to annex independent properties like mine. This isn't a matter of interpretation, it's a matter of truth." I paused, letting the weight of my evidence sink in as murmurs of approval spread among the gathered farmers. One of the local farmers, an older man with a voice that commanded respect, stepped forward. "I've been a landowner here for over 30 years, he said. "I can attest that my property, like his, has always been independent. We will not be bullied into submission by your HOA's overreach." His words resonated with everyone, and I could see the defiant spark in their eyes. The inspector shifted uncomfortably and attempted to regain control. "Sir, if you refuse to comply, the HOA will have no choice but to initiate legal proceedings," he warned. I smiled, a hint of sarcastic amusement in my tone. "Legal proceedings? I have a highly competent attorney, Dan, ready to counter any lawsuit you throw at me. And let's not forget, the City Council has already ruled in our favor. Your legal threats are as empty as your so-called guidelines." At that moment, one of his colleagues, a younger representative with a nervous glint in his eye, spoke up. We can discuss alternative solutions if you're willing to negotiate," he offered hesitantly. It was the first crack in their unified front. "Negotiate," I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Tell me, what does the HOA propose?" "That I dismantle the very structures that define my farm's character, just to fit into your suburban fantasy." There was a long pause as the representatives exchanged uncertain looks. The tension was palpable. Finally, the inspector sighed heavily. "We are prepared to retract our immediate actions if you agree to a review of your property by an independent assessor," he proposed, his voice losing some of its former authority. "That way, we can resolve this matter without further escalation." I took a moment, surveying the faces of my neighbors, resolute, defiant, yet hopeful. "An independent assessor, you say?" I mused aloud. "And who is to guarantee that this assessor won't be influenced by the same interests that fuel your HOA? I propose that we have a joint inspection, with representatives from our community, and a third-party expert who is completely unaffiliated with any local authority." I paused for effect, letting my words hang in the cool night air. "I'm not interested in a backroom negotiation that ultimately forces me into submission. I want transparency, fairness, and a commitment to the truth of my property's boundaries." The room fell silent as the inspector considered my terms. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, and I could see that my firm stance was beginning to crack their defiant veneer. Finally, with a reluctant nod, he said, "We will consider your proposal. However, any further delay will be viewed as non-compliance on your part." I met his gaze steadily. "Then I suggest we schedule this joint inspection immediately. Until then, I expect all intrusive actions on my property to cease." There was a brief moment of silence before the representatives turned and retreated back to their van. I could feel the weight of the confrontation lift slightly. A victory, however small, in the face of a relentless system. My neighbors clapped me on the shoulder and exchanged relieved glances, knowing that while the fight was far from over, we had taken a stand that would not be easily forgotten. As I watched their van disappear into the night, I knew that this direct confrontation had forced the HOA's hand. The decisions made tonight would have far-reaching consequences, and I was ready to see them through. My land was my life, and I wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how high their authority, dictate how I lived it. The tension had been simmering for weeks, and now it reached a fever pitch on an unexpectedly stormy night. I had been on high alert ever since the joint inspection proposal, and that day, Everything came to a head in a confrontation that would decide the fate of my property once and for all. It started just as dusk settled over the farm. The air was thick with moisture, and the distant rumble of thunder promised a storm. I was in my study, meticulously reviewing the last batch of evidence and finalizing my notes for the upcoming joint inspection, when my phone rang. It was Dan, my attorney, his voice urgent and low. "There's been a development," he said. "The HOA has summoned an emergency meeting with the City Council. They're trying to force a resolution tonight." I felt my pulse spike. This was it, the final showdown. I grabbed my evidence binder, a folder of all my meticulously documented encounters, and headed out. Rain began to pelt the windows as I drove to the council chamber, where a small crowd of landowners and concerned citizens had already gathered. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and a palpable sense of defiance. Inside the chamber, heated voices and determined expressions filled the room. The council chairman, flanked by a few stern-faced officials, called the meeting to order. "We have received undeniable evidence of misconduct by the HOA on rural properties," he announced. "Tonight, we address these grievances head-on." I took my seat among my fellow landowners, my fingers gripping the binder like a lifeline. Just as the chairman began to outline the agenda, the heavy door burst open. The HOA inspector stormed in, flanked by his remaining representatives. His usual smug demeanor was replaced by a look of barely concealed panic. He cleared his throat and attempted to speak, but the murmurs of discontent silenced him almost immediately. Seizing the moment, I stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice echoing in the packed room, "I stand before you not just as a victim, but as a defender of our right to live independently. My property, as you can see in these official records and security footage, is not subject to your arbitrary rules." I held up the land deed and a series of prints that detailed every unwarranted action by the HOA. The evidence was undeniable, each piece a testament to the overreach and corruption that had plagued us. The council chairman leaned forward. "The evidence is compelling," he said. "But we must consider the HOA's perspective as well." The inspector, who had been fidgeting at the back, tried to interject. "Our actions were meant to enforce community standards." I cut him off sharply. "Community standards? What you call standards are nothing but a thin veil for your power grab." My voice grew louder, filled with righteous indignation. "You've invaded my privacy, marked my land without any authority, and even threatened physical action. This isn't enforcement, it's intimidation." As I spoke, the room erupted into murmurs of agreement. I could see heads nodding, and even some council members exchanged looks of determined resolve. One of the representatives from the local property management firm, who had earlier testified about the bogus incentives, stood up and added, "We have seen firsthand the damage your tactics cause. We demand that you cease your actions immediately." At that moment, a heavy silence fell over the chamber. The inspector's face turned ashen. He opened his mouth to speak, but then the chairman raised his hand, signaling for quiet. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented and the testimonies from our community members, I declare that the HOA's actions on these properties are not only unauthorized, but constitute an abuse of power," he announced firmly. "Effective immediately. All further inspections and enforcement actions on rural properties are suspended, and an investigation into these practices will be launched." The room exploded in applause and shouts of relief. In that instant, I felt the full weight of our victory, but the final blow was yet to come. The inspector, now visibly trembling, attempted one last desperate appeal. "This decision is premature," he stuttered, his voice cracking under the pressure. "How we are only trying to maintain order." But his words were drowned out by a resounding collective roar of "Enough!" With a final, frustrated glare, the inspector backed away, escorted out of the chamber by security. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of triumph and catharsis. The final, decisive blow had been struck against the HOA's tyranny. I stood there, heart pounding, as the council members continued their discussion about next steps. The chairman concluded, "Let this be a lesson to any institution that overreaches its bounds. Today, we stand for the rights of every independent landowner." Stepping outside into the cool, post-storm air, I felt an immense sense of relief and vindication. The battle had been fierce, the stakes astronomical, but we had prevailed. My property was safe, and the corrupt practices of the HOA had been exposed for all to see. That night, as I returned to my farmhouse, I couldn't help but smile. I knew there would be challenges ahead, but for now the final blow had been delivered, and justice had been served. My land remained mine, untainted by the bureaucratic ambitions of those who sought to control it. The day of reckoning had finally arrived. The tension that had been building over weeks was now palpable as I prepared for the ultimate showdown, a moment that would decide not just the fate of my property, but also the future of every independent landowner caught in the HOA's crosshairs. I stood in the middle of the community center's assembly hall, my binder of irrefutable evidence clutched tightly in one hand, while my laptop was connected to the projector, ready to display every piece of documentation, every video clip, and every internal memo that exposed the HOA's elaborate scheme. The room was filled with a mix of local farmers, concerned citizens, and city council members, all eager to see justice served. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the promise of a long-awaited victory. The council chairman took the stage and introduced the session, emphasizing the importance of transparency and the community's right to self-determination. One by one, representatives of the community recounted their experiences, stories of unexplained visits, arbitrary violation notices, and even physical intimidation tactics that had left many of us reeling. When it was my turn, I stepped forward, resolved to lay bare every injustice that had been inflicted upon me. Clearing my throat, I began, "Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand before you not as a disgruntled landowner, but as a defender of our fundamental right to live free from bureaucratic tyranny. I have gathered undeniable evidence that the actions of the HOA, actions that were purportedly aimed at maintaining community standards, are nothing more than a deliberate, orchestrated effort to force independent properties into submission." I clicked through my presentation slides, and the room was bathed in the harsh light of raw truth. The first slide displayed high-resolution images of my property deed and survey documents, proving unequivocally that my land lay outside any legally recognized HOA boundary. Gasps and murmurs of approval rippled through the audience. I continued, "These are not vague approximations, but official records that confirm my property's independence. Yet, despite this, the HOA has been relentlessly harassing me." The next slides rolled by, security camera footage of the inspector and his cronies, the blue paint splattered on my boundary, and the internal emails revealing a covert plan to annex rural properties for profit. Every image, every clip, was a nail in the coffin of the HOA's claims. "This footage," I declared, "shows an inspector measuring my fence with a laser device as if my humble farm were a construction site awaiting demolition. And here," I said, pointing to an email chain on the screen, "is an internal memo where officials discuss maximizing revenue through strategic annexations. These are not isolated incidents. They are components of a systematic assault on our freedoms." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of the evidence settling over everyone present. A council member, his face etched with disbelief, asked, "Can you confirm that these documents are authentic?" I nodded, and Dan, my attorney, took the floor to verify the validity of every piece of evidence. His confirmation was the final seal of approval that left no room for doubt. At that moment, the atmosphere in the hall shifted dramatically. The murmurs grew louder, turning into unanimous nods of support. Even the council chairman's stern expression softened into one of resolute determination. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, we find that the HOA has indeed overstepped its authority," he pronounced. "Their actions on rural properties, including those detailed in today's presentation, are not only unauthorized but amount to an abuse of power." A ripple of applause broke out across the room. The HOA representatives, already reeling from previous confrontations, now appeared visibly shaken. The inspector attempted one final plea, his voice weak and trembling. We were only enforcing the guidelines, but his words were drowned out by the collective roar of the assembly. I took a deep breath and added, "This decision today is not just a victory for me. It is a triumph for every independent landowner who has ever been bullied into submission. Today we send a clear message. No institution, no matter how powerful it may seem, has the right to dictate how we live on our own land." The council chairman then delivered the decisive blow. Effective immediately, the HOA is ordered to cease all inspection and enforcement activities on rural properties. Furthermore, an independent investigation will be launched into the practices of the HOA, and any officials found guilty of overreach will be held accountable under the law. At that moment, as thunder rumbled outside and the assembly hall erupted in cheers, I felt a surge of vindication so profound that tears welled up in my eyes. The battle had reached its climax, a turning point where justice prevailed, and the oppressive tactics of the HOA were exposed for all to see. In that charged moment, I knew that the freedom I had fought so hard to protect was secured. The final blow had been delivered, and the corrupt practices of the HOA were dismantled by the unwavering will of a united community. My property, and the legacy of every independent landowner, had won a monumental victory. The room's applause was not just for me, but for the power of truth and the resilience of those who refused to be controlled. In the days that followed that monumental council decision, a sense of calm and hard-won victory settled over my farm. I walked through my fields with a renewed appreciation for every furrow and every tree, knowing that my property, which had been under siege for so long, was finally secure. It wasn't just my land that had been defended that day. It was the spirit of independence that belongs to every property owner who refused to let an overreaching system dictate how they live. Every time I looked at the evidence pinned up on the wall of my study, a collage of official documents, security footage stills, and internal emails, I was reminded of the long, arduous battle that had culminated in that decisive moment at the council meeting. Those moments of anxiety, the nights spent poring over footage, and the countless phone calls with Dan, my attorney, had all been worth it. The victory wasn't just legal, it was personal. It was a triumph over bureaucratic tyranny, and a testament to the resilience of anyone who values freedom over conformity. In the aftermath, my neighbors and I began to share our stories more openly. We organized community gatherings on my porch, where we talked about our struggles, our hopes, and the small victories that lit our way forward. It wasn't just about protesting the HOA's overreach anymore. It was about rebuilding our sense of community and standing together as a united front. Over cups of coffee and homemade pie, we laughed about the absurdity of it all, but we also planned for the future, determined to never let our rights be trampled again. Local news outlets picked up our story, and soon my farm became a symbol of resistance. I received letters, emails, and social media messages from landowners in distant regions who faced similar issues. Their support was overwhelming. It reminded me that our fight was part of a larger struggle against the encroachment of power into our personal lives. Each message served as a reminder that when ordinary people stand together, even the most entrenched systems can be challenged. I spent the following weeks restoring my property, removing the blue paint that had been carelessly splattered on my boundary, repairing the damage caused by the unauthorized inspections, and reinforcing the very structures that represented my independence. Every nail hammered and every board replaced became a small act of defiance, a physical reminder that I was in control of my destiny. I documented the restoration process in a series of video updates, sharing them with the community online. These updates were not just about fixing a fence or repainting a barn. They were about reclaiming my space and sending a clear message: my land, my rules. Throughout this period, I continued to receive support from the City Council and from community leaders who vowed to keep a close watch on any further attempts by the HOA to extend its reach. The investigation into their practices was ongoing, and although I knew that dismantling an entrenched bureaucracy wouldn't happen overnight, I felt a profound sense of hope. The Council's decision had set a precedent, and it signaled that no one, no matter how powerful their position, was above the law. Looking back, I realized that this battle transformed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I grew more patient, more determined, and more aware of the power that comes from standing up for what is right. I learned that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the truth can prevail if you're willing to fight for it. That hard-fought victory on that stormy day wasn't just about protecting my property. It was about affirming the right of every individual to live without undue interference. Now, as I sit on my porch watching the sun set over fields that have once again become a sanctuary of peace, I reflect on the journey with a mix of gratitude and a touch of bittersweet nostalgia. I know that challenges will come and go, and that the fight for freedom is never truly over. But I also know that when you stand together, armed with truth and unwavering resolve, you can make a difference. So, to anyone out there who has ever felt bullied by an overreaching institution, who has ever been told that your property or your way of life isn't good enough, remember this: you have the power to fight back. Your voice matters, and your story matters. Before I sign off, I want to ask you all, have you ever experienced a moment when you had to stand up against a seemingly invincible system? How did you overcome it? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Your experiences might just inspire someone else to fight for their rights. And if you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button, share this video, and join our community of independent thinkers and doers. Thank you for watching, and remember, never let anyone tell you how to live your life. Stay free, stay strong, and I'll see you in the next video.